We are live tonight with Standing for Truth, Nephilimfree, Guzman, and Superbad. Guys, I want to thank you for joining me today. Well, tonight I know it's a little bit late, but I'm sure this is going to be a fun hangout here. We're going to address some of the objections and arguments, but I'm sure this is going to be a fun from the atheist side. I'm going to mute Superbad right now. I can hear the Superbad. I just got you mute. We could hear, I think, some sound in the background. But Neph, if you want to say a couple things.
It's fixed
real
now.
Quick.
It's fixed now.
Perfect, brother. Perfect. You know what? Let's just get right into it. I want to. I'm getting up the LMN phylogenetic tree here onto the screen. We're gonna have Superbad touch on a few things. For anybody that listened to the discussion the other night, it was really good. Neff did a great job. Superbad did a great job. Lots of good points were brought up. One portion that really stuck out at me was the section on pre-existing heterozygosity, pre-existing DNA differences, the design variation that Superbad was trying to explain to Drag, that they use the two allele argument, which certainly we don't disagree with, but obviously, you know, there's a strong misunderstanding on what we mean by these designed and functional DNA differences. And, you know, obviously we're not saying that they're due to mutation. That would be the evolutionist assumption. So I think reasonably, you know, we can conclude that most useful variations are design variations. I don't think that that's a bad assumption based on the biblical base model. I mean, why would God create clones, right? Now, when we see adaptive selection occurring, say, we're usually witnessing segregation and recombination of useful variants of genes and gene components that we're saying are designed to segregate and recombine in the first place. So if there's going to be a sorting issue, like some of the atheists will say, well, that wouldn't make much sense. Obviously, God would place these in areas that, you know, can segregate and can recombine. But in that case, I just want to cover the fact that, you know, selection favors the most desirable recombinants and segregants of this design variation. Right now, if we actually take, for example, because I know Drag, he was using the example of, you know, a single human couple. But if they understand our model of DNA differences, if they contain designed and functional heterozygosity at even a tiny fraction of their nucleotides, they would actually produce, say through, you know, recombination, gene conversion, an essentially unlimited range of useful diversity. And it's this type of design diversity that Superbad was trying to, actually, he did a good job at getting it across to Drag. He just didn't seem to comprehend it. I noticed the evolutionists have a problem with that at times, but natural selection can act upon this most effectively. Now, like I just said, all such design variants, they would actually be expected to be created within useful linkage groups and would have originated at high allelic frequencies. So, for example, to end it here, just to make it easy to understand, in the case of an initial single human couple, say Adam and Eve, where there could be only 4 initial sets of chromosomes, all initial nucleotide variants would have a frequency of at least 25%. Functional linkage groups and high initial allele frequencies greatly enhance the selection efficiency. What that does is it now enables rapid local adaptation, kind of like an ordered deck of cards. The net information in such a scenario, as I'm going into here, would be greatest at the beginning, but diversity would be greatest only after many cycles of shuffling. Except at the beginning, no new functional information would be required. Another argument, I think it was Crispr that brought up, he was saying that they're all, some of these DNA differences were, you know, would result in disease. I think he was having the assumption that they were mutations versus design variation, which was a common misunderstanding on the fall. Do you remember that portion, Neff and Superbad? If you can kind of give your take on that. And Superbad, what I just said, would that be a valid explanation of the pre-existing DNA differences that we're talking about that will lead to the rapid speciation, explaining the biodiversity? Go ahead.
Well, I would just say God put the genetic diversity, the ability for DNA adaptive change into his creation. And we see that today. We see it, it's always been present. But there are limits to the change that organisms are able to produce. I mean, you can get, you produce a donkey, and what do you get? The inability to breathe. That's a limitation. So is it donkeys or mules? I think donkeys are immune, not mules. I might have my wires crossed there, but there are limitations. The truth is, we just don't know of a mechanism for the design of any of these fantastical features that must arise if evolution were true, and the number of them is countless, in the millions. So God gave, just like the Bible says, God created certain kinds, and they have the ability to vary within those kinds. But we don't see one kind produce another kind in the fossil record. We don't see anything arising incrementally in the body plan of any existing species on this planet. If evolution were true, there would be thousands upon thousands of new anatomical features arising in the body plans of the billion species on this planet. We can't find one. There is none. Evolution can't be a process that only happened in the past. It has to be something that's continuously ongoing. So there's just no evidence of that, and don't even know of a genetic mechanism that could do it, because that would require new, complex, specified, interdependent, correlative information that spans the genome, and that just doesn't happen. There's no scientific evidence that supports that idea.
And what I find funny is in your debate portion with CRISPR, the first one, you're asking for a beneficial mutation that's not deleterious by any means, because we know beneficial mutations are certainly environmentally dependent. But he used the growth in a femur, in the femur length, but I don't think he's understanding the fact that it's really about net loss versus net gain. And I like the way you put it, Neff, where it's like, if you want to explain it, how you're going up, a set of stairs or going up a mountain and you take, 5 steps. But if you want to expand on that, how you said it, because I think it perfectly explains the fact that you're going to need thousands of these information adding mutations to take your fish to fisherman, right?
Oh, there will be a great many of cooperative mutations. Science shows just to get 2 would require a level of time greater than the age of the Earth, possibly as long more than the age of the universe, to get 2 cooperative mutations, just 2. And now this would have had to have been happening by the bajillions all throughout the history of evolution. See, that demonstrates the incredible discrepancy, the disparaging distance between evolution theory and science. Science shows us just to get 2 cooperative mutations that could build some little tiny bit of genetic information is an outrageously vast era of time. Just insane, millions upon millions of years, right? But evolutionists claim it happens in weeks or months or years, and it has to have happened thousands upon thousands times thousands times thousands times thousands times thousands of times, and is ongoing right now. But it's just not.
I don't think that they can grasp just how difficult it really is to say build a genome apart from design, right? I don't think they can understand that in regards to, say, the entropic degeneration of our genome, that a population itself can actually be undergoing genetic decline, Neff, due to, say, the vast numbers of slightly deleterious mutations, even while, and obviously nobody disagrees with selection, but even while selection may be amplifying a handful of beneficial mutations, right? Now, that means that they're failing to realize that a species can undergo these minor adaptive fine-tuning to, say, to its environment, even while degenerating in many other ways, right? So if you picture a car right? Say an 8-year-old car, it is degenerating in all possible ways. Whether you install new windshield wipers, the question is, has the car really stopped degenerating? Certainly, there's been an improvement. No one's going to disagree with that, but not the type of improvement that's going to reverse this, systematic degeneration, right? So it all comes down to a net loss versus a net gain. CRISPR can present, this one beneficial mutation that apparently, leads to the lengthening of a femur bone. But at the end of the day, it's not going to explain, or it's not going to solve this degeneration problem, right, Neff?
It can't. Entropy is a fact. It's highly documented. It's all the way back to Haldane in the 1930s. Numerous scientists have discussed it. Kondrashov produced a paper several years back that really set the evolutionist world on fire when he wrote a paper that states that human beings, logically, human beings should have gone extinct 100 times over in the history of mankind because of the accruing effects of slightly degenerate mutations. The name of the paper is Contamination of the Genome by Very Slightly Deleterious Mutations. Why have we not died 100 times over? So the fact is that science just demonstrates that mutation is destructive. Evolutionists have this mythological belief that mutation is beneficial, and it just designs the most unfathomable complexity and interdependence. All the complex features of living things were designed by these random damage events to DNA. It's a ridiculous myth, and it's one of the hallmarks of why evolution theory is doomed to fail in the coming century, because it just can't continue to put forth the idea that evolution is true when science has so thoroughly documented that mutation is not a designer of anything, but a destroyer of everything.
Yep, certainly mutations are not construction, they're destruction. I want to get into the LMN portion of the discussion during, with CRISPR and drag and immutable there. CRISPR left a lengthy comment. I wanted to give Superbad the opportunity to kind of go into this a little bit thoroughly here. To put it in a nutshell, what Superbad, actually what we're all saying is that genetics match predictions of the flood model perfectly, right? We were talking about how mitochondrial DNA is inherited exclusively from mothers, but there's 3 young women, married women on the ark who would have repopulated the earth after the flood 4,500 years ago. And what we see is that there's actually 3 major types of human mitochondrial DNA in the world, right? The LMN haplogroups. Now, what's also consistent is the Babel dispersion, where one would actually expect sudden formation of, say, several variants of this human mitochondrial DNA, obviously due to the rapid separation and isolation of various groups of people. And the fact that we observe all this, genetics itself proves conclusively that the biblical model, best explains the observable evidence. But Superbad, I want you to kind of explain it a little more thoroughly and adapt, or if you're there, Superbad, you can take over the floor. And I'm also going to share screen here at the LMN map here. So if you want to go ahead there.
I still don't see the map. Can you please?
Yeah, if you want to if you just want to start talking.
This is a very technical thing, so I need the map.
Okay, you let me know if you can see it in here. There you are, brother. Can you see it?
Make it larger. Make it larger, please.
How's that?
Can I? All right.
That's as large as it's going to get, brother. But go ahead, take the floor.
Okay. If you don't understand something, please say immediately, because I don't want anybody to get lost here. Okay? Hello?
Yeah, we hear you.
Yeah, there's some
you.
delay.
We hear you, brother.
Okay. Is there echo? I can hear a lot of echo.
No, I think it's okay on your end.
Yeah, and I also getting delays.
Just
Okay.
make sure, as long as everybody's, you know, appropriately muted here.
Yeah.
There's no background noise. Let me see here. I'm gonna try.
I'm muted.
Yeah, no, you're good.
Yeah, I live in Asia. That's why I'm getting delays.
Okay,
Okay.
just take your time. No rush. We're just gonna stay silent in order to avoid any type of significant echo. If there's any other issues, you just ask us. Okay, there, Superbad.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Everybody see the map, right? When we use direct measurements of mitochondrial DNA differences, by using direct measurements of mitochondrial DNA differences between people groups from all continents, you will more or less get this map when you line up the differences. Doesn't matter where you're from. You're from Asia or North America, South America. As much samples, DNA samples, mitochondrial DNA samples as possible is the best way to get the haplogroups. This map. This is the haplogroup map. This is based on direct measurements of the haplogroups. I did strip away some few evolutionary bias on how they created their map, but of course I will represent the evolutionist position as well as I can. Okay. Okay. By the way, when I say direct measurements, a mom's mitochondrial DNA is directly compared to her daughter's DNA. Okay, direct comparison, the number of differences, few or a lot. And usually when you compare DNA differences between you and your parent, it's few. But if you compare it with someone else from another part of the world, it would be huge. Okay, so direct measurements, because I know evolutionists do not do direct measurements. They use their evolutionary bias sometimes to integrate their measurements. And we do it, I do it using direct measurements. Okay, hang on. Okay, when a mom's mitochondrial differences is directly compared to her daughter's DNA and someone else's from another part of the world, you can line them up. And when more and more people groups mitochondrial DNA are gathered and being lined up, this map right here automatically comes out. It doesn't come out if you do not measure enough people's DNA. I forgot the exact figure, but if I'm not mistaken, you need at least 500 people to 1,000. This map here, I think, is 500 to 1,000. Sorry, I forgot the exact number. But when you do that to different people groups around the world, this map will always be like this, more or less. More or less, this is the pattern you get, the primary pattern using direct measurements. Okay, as you can see, there are three blue arrows. You guys see it? The three blue arrows?
Yes.
Okay, the three blue arrows are the L, M, N haplogroups. As you can see, they will always be distinct and unique and easily noticeable when you compare mitochondrial DNA differences between people groups from all continents. Okay? And based on creationist assumptions, I will have to use the word assumption, because if I say this is fact, evolutionists will not be happy at all. So the L, M, N are Noah's daughters-in-law. That is our creationist assumptions. Notice the blue arrow is the L, okay? You guys following? The blue arrow is the L.
Yes, good point.
The blue arrow is the L. Sorry, the middle blue arrow. There are 3 arrows, right? The middle one is the L, which represents African differences. As you can see, it's in the middle of M and N. And evolutionists interpret that as the starting point which connects M and N. Okay, you following?
Yes.
Yeah.
Here's the question. Now, why do they interpret it that way? Why do they interpret that the L, the M and N came from the L? Now, according to what I learned in evolutionary literature a long time ago, and I've been updating myself ever since, they interpret it that way because the L, or the African branch, as you can see, sorry, I forgot to say, the letter L is the African branch. Okay? The letter L is the African branch. It has the longest branch or haplogroups. Did you notice? Here, right here, it has the longest one, longest branch. Did you see it?
Yeah.
Yes, we see the longest branch.
Okay. So right now, hang on. As you can see, it spans the length of the entire map, right? So right now we see 2 unique patterns. First, the LMN, Noah's daughters-in-law. Okay, we see that clearly, always like that when you compare genetic differences
It's
in
very
MD.
clear,
Yes. And what is the other thing that we see clearly other than the LMN? The very long African branch. This is how I correctly represent the evolutionary position. I will not just cut that African branch because I am not as biased as evolutionists. So I represent them very well. That is, so we see 2 distinct groups, LMN here, African branch here. Okay, you following?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
The length of that branch, okay, the African branch. Evolutionists interpret that as a long time scale due to larger genetic differences compared to other haplogroups worldwide. And sorry, wait, hang on. And yeah, and that's also their basis for creating their out of Africa scenario, because the branch, as you can see, is very long. It's different from the rest of the world, meaning more genetic differences and more time. That's their assumption. It's
Can I interrupt? I'm sorry. I want to share a better picture of this that make it easy for people to talk while you're talking. I want to interrupt. If you'll stop screen sharing, I'll show a picture that'll help you, and then you can go right back to talking. Can I do that?
That picture is enough. I think that picture is enough.
Well, it probably is. But
Okay, I just stopped the screen share. So Neff, if you want to share yours now. Is mine gone?
yeah,
Yeah,
it's gone. Let me screen share this, and you can keep on talking, because this one really, I think, shows exactly what he's talking about in a better way.
I don't think so. I need to represent the evolutionary position using the other map. I don't want evolutionists to accuse me of bias. So I need the other map, please.
Well, this is based on actual science, but I mean, if you don't want me to share it, I'll stop.
Yeah, no offense, but I need the other map. Thank you.
Okay. Well, the other one doesn't show the names of the groups. That's all. Nobody's going to have a clue what you're talking about looking at that one.
I'm speaking directly to evolutionists here. They'll know the technique. They'll know what I mean. They'll understand what I'm talking about.
You know what? At the end of the day, I think it is a good. It certainly is a good idea that you're doing it in an unbiased way, and I like the fact that you've exposed their bias in that last discussion, because it was funny how Drag admitted that I don't read any of the creationist literature, and they have no idea, what our literature says, which was evident by the fact that he didn't even know our most simple arguments in regards to DNA differences. But aside from that, can you see the image there, Superbad?
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
Hang on a bit. Yeah, sorry about that. Where was I? Okay, the African branch. Okay. Okay, so the African branch, which is the longest branch, evolutionists interpret as their long time scale due to larger genetic differences compared to other haplogroups worldwide, and that was the basis why they create their out of Africa scenario. Along with that, I don't know if Crispr is listening, but Crispr is referring to during the debate, the L1, L0, and the other Ls are located on that African branch, as you can see. Can you see the other branches spraying off the African branch? Can you guys see it? Those are the L1, L0s, the other Ls Crispr was referring to. So I do not want to misrepresent his position here. So you see it? You guys understand?
Yeah, well, I understand what you're talking about, but the problem with the picture is it doesn't show the haplogroups. It's just line drawing.
It does show the haplogroups.
I don't see any H1 or anything.
This map is based on direct measurements of genetic mitochondrial DNA differences. I am talking to evolutionists here who knows this stuff.
Okay, keep going there, Superbad.
Yes. Where was I again? All right. Okay, so Crispr was
descending, everything coming off the African branch.
Sorry, what did you say?
You were on the topic of everything coming off the African branch.
The Ls, the other haplogroups, the other Ls. The evolutionist yesterday was, or the other day was referring to. So I want to make sure that I accurately represent his position. I do not want them to accuse me of bias, because I am not as biased as them. Okay. So you can see branches spraying away from the primary branch. Can you guys see it?
Yeah.
From the African difference map, the African part. Can you guys see it?
We see it. It just doesn't tell us which haplogroup is what.
It doesn't matter. The L0, L1, L2 that Crispr was referring to the other day, they're all there. Only there in that long African branch. Okay? So everybody following?
Yeah, keep going, keep going. We're following.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I don't dispute. I don't dispute what he said. Okay. Now, may I get back to the other point I was referring to a while ago?
Yes, you can get back.
We all clearly see the LMN distinct as in unique. You can easily notice everything goes back to the LMNN. And we can also see the long African branch. Okay, the LMN being distinct is the creationist worldview, and the long African branch is the evolutionist worldview. Understand?
Yeah.
Okay. So if you're gonna interpret it objectively, and I will not be biased, the evidence can go either way at this point. It's a battle over the same evidence, different interpretations. Evolutionists will not concede that, but they know it is because of their bias. And I am not biased. Now, there are ways to break this tie, and it mostly depends on creationist research, which I'm sure evolutionists will not entertain. To break the tie and to defeat the evolutionist worldview, creationists will have to prove that the massive genetic differences in Africa were not the result of a long time scale. Okay? If we do that, then the entire evolutionary out of Africa collapses. Okay? So we have to prove that those differences in Africa were not the result of a long time scale. Because evolutionists assume huge genetic differences are long time scale, like I said during the debate the other day. Okay, for now, creationists have preliminary data, for example, from the UN, which CRISPR tried to disprove. But since I said it's just only a preliminary data, we are still working on it. The UN is still working on it, that those differences were not due to evolution, but they were due to Africans historically marrying early. And when Africans marry early historically, it will expand the genetic differences in Africa. Okay? If Africans didn't marry early like the rest of the world, then their differences will more or less be the same as non-African mitochondrial DNA differences. Plus, we also have preliminary data. Okay, did you guys get that part? Did you?
Yeah.
All right. Okay, that's one preliminary creationist evidence to debunk the entire evolutionary out of Africa. It is not debunked yet. It is not debunked yet. I will not be biased. I will say it is not debunked yet. Both models are still strong. Okay, so there's another evidence. What was that again? Plus, we also have preliminary data that the Middle East may be the hub. Guys, I'm hearing some problems with the sound. Do you hear it?
I think I heard a little bit of screeching and echoing.
I think you're good now there, Superbad.
Yeah,
Let me
you're good.
change. Let me use my headset. Okay, everything. Can you guys hear me?
Yep,
Yeah,
go
we
ahead.
hear you. Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. So other than the UN data, creationists also have preliminary evidence or data that the Middle East, sorry, not just creationists, but also secular sources. Plus, we also, and I know evolutionists will accuse creationists of using preliminary data. I am saying yes, we are using preliminary data. Happy? Okay. So we also have evidence of preliminary data that the Middle East may be the hub of genetic diversity more than Africa. Right now, we know that Africa is the largest, has the most genetic diversity compared to the rest of the world. Okay? But the Middle East is also rivaling it. It's preliminary data. We don't know for sure yet. Another hint is that migration patterns in Africa are the same as the Middle East. So which is it? Okay? And if this holds true, this alone could debunk the entire out of Africa scenario of evolutionists. we will have to wait for a long time before we completely understand the DNA language. We may not know the end results of all of this until we understand the entire DNA language. Biased evolutionists who have a lot at stake in this creation evolution debate will not admit that they have a lot at stake. Even when I was still an evolutionist before, I have already seen this bias. And I didn't care at that time because I wasn't a creationist yet. Okay, let me go back to the point. There's another evidence against the out of Africa. All right? And evolutionists did not include this in their out of Africa because it contradicts their data, which pisses me off. Okay, when you go to the west of Africa, okay, all right, let me explain this clearly. Let's say this is Africa, right? And this is the Middle East. When you move away as far as you can from the Middle East or Africa, genetic diversity decreases. Okay? From any direction, genetic diversity decreases. Now, the same is true. Okay? I was talking about the world. Now, let's go to Africa. It's the same case in Africa. When you go south of Africa, genetic diversity also decreases. Or the west of Africa, genetic diversity also decreases. So what is south of Africa? South of Africa are the L1, L2, L0s that Crispr was referring to the other day. Now, if genetic, okay, it means, okay, okay, at first, right, we use the globe, right, the world map. When you move away from the Middle East of Africa, genetic diversity decreases, but it's also the same with Africa. Move south of Africa, move west of Africa, genetic differences also decreases. It means the center of genetic diversity is either in North, East Africa, or the Western Middle East. So if that is true, and this is preliminary data, again, I admit this is preliminary data. So do not accuse me of bias, evolutionists. If this is true, the center of the genetic diversity worldwide is in Northeast Africa or Western Middle East. So what happens to the other L's Crispr was referring to the other day? The L1, L0, L3, the other L's he was referring to. They collapse as well. If you know genetics well enough, Crispr, you would know what I mean. Because those L's that you refer to rely on larger genetic differences. But if those genetic differences are lower, or they decrease as you go south, and since the L's are in the south, then what happens to your L's? Have you thought about that? Okay.
That's a good point. I mean, if evolution were true, we should have seen more haplogroups pop up around the world altogether, and we should have seen more of them pop up in Africa, and we wouldn't see the dependency upon L.
Yes,
yeah.
That's another point, but I will not use that here. I will not use that here because I do not want to scare all evolutionists.
No, I do.
Well, we're different. I want to represent them more accurately. And what that does
believe what they
is
believe.
jumble that when genetic diversity decreases going south of Africa with the L0, L1, L2 thing, that jumbles the L's that CRISPR is referring to. Reducing their diversity would remove the other L haplogroups. And when his haplogroups are removed, what happens? It leaves the L, M, and N alone. The rest are gone. And when that happens, the map completely then belongs to creationists. And you will have to use your rescuing device, whatever it is, evolutionists, that you have prepared for all contradictions in your theory. All the preliminary data. All right, so that's it. I'm willing to admit my data is incomplete, but are evolutionists willing? I doubt it, because jobs are at stake, careers are at stake, research grants are at stake. That's all I have to say. Any questions?
No, I think that was really good. I really like your unbiased take on it. I think that strikes fear in the hearts of the evolutionists, knowing that, you know, there's so much evidence against their precious theory in science fiction religion, and although some of it is preliminary, like you said, they're just that close to having to admit you know, that their entire theory is wrong and that biblical creation could be true. And as I look at the mitochondrial DNA map of humanity, you know, the three major haplogroups that we're talking about here, they're joined by relatively short line segments, right? And that indicates there's not much difference between them. So this is why we're saying that it's consistent with the three young women on the ark, in that, you know, they came from a world where only a few generations had actually lived before them. But what's also important, and what also fits our model, is that from these three nodes emit dozens of other mitochondrial DNA variants. And now those variants, they're each at a relatively greater distance than the three major haplogroups. So this is actually now consistent with the dispersion at Babel, where there would have been rapid dispersion and isolation of these dozens of groups. Now, since Babel,
I say something. I say something. After you're done, I forgot to add something.
Yeah, I'll just finish.
After you're done. Sorry for interrupting you.
No problem. I'll just finish what I was saying at Babel, because I think that's important too, because it just further confirms our model. We know that there have been many generations accounting for this, you know, relatively larger distances between the dozens of mitochondrial DNA variants that we actually see today, and the three major haplogroups from which they emerge. So I think that's pretty incredible, because, to be honest with you, the history of humanity, as you know, pointed out in the Bible, is actually in our genome. So what we actually know about the mitochondrial DNA of humans fits the 6,000 year biblical time scale. It explains the three you know, major haplogroups and the relative differences between pre and post-flood humanity. So I think, you know, for the most part, even though some of it's, you know, preliminary, I still think it's as close to win for biblical creation as we're going to get. Go ahead.
Okay. I know what evolutionists are going to say. What is my... How can I prove this? Like I said, it's preliminary. So whatever your reply to this is, it will become a worldview thing. Okay? It will be a tie. I wouldn't care what your reply is. Okay? You get it? One more thing.
Yes.
Lastly. Hey, standing for truth, the map. I need the map. Sorry.
Just 1 second. Go ahead. Oh, just 1 sec. There you are.
Okay, let's pretend for a while that we remove evolutionary bias. Because like I said, I included the evolutionary data here as well. Let's remove the African branch for a while. Let's pretend it's not that long. Okay, you guys following? Following? Hello? Hello?
Yeah, we're hearing you.
Yeah, there's an echo.
We hear you.
Hang on. Okay.
Yeah, we hear you fine.
All right. Sorry. It's my my headset has problems too. Okay. Okay. Removing the evolutionary long time scale over there, the African branch, for example. Here, let's cut it here, somewhere here in the middle. It leaves the YEC, the young Earth creationist time scale, as you can see. And this genetic differences map, we can make testable predictions based on this map. If YEC is true, and this is the history of civilizations written within our mitochondrial DNA, we should be able to see and find extra biblical events in this map. An echo of it, an haplogroup of it. Okay, to be specific, a haplogroup of it. You guys understand? A haplogroup, for example. Let's see.
Are you talking about testable and falsifiable predictions here based
Yes.
on? Yep. Okay. Because I noticed in the chat one of the evolutionists, you know, he said,
I don't care what they say. I don't care what they say.
I'm saying this is good because they were scoffing at everything we said, saying, "Oh, that's not falsifiable." Well, lo and behold, here's how you falsify it. So I'm glad you're going into this. Go ahead, Superbad.
Of course, they have to. Their research grants, government grants are at stake. Their lives are at stake. Their atheism are at stake. And I'm so glad I'm no longer an atheist. I hated them. Okay, here. So with these this genetic differences map, we should be able to make testable predictions and falsifiable to make the evolutionists feel better. We should be able to predict extra biblical events within that map. An echo, a haplogroup, for example, during the Roman Empire. Where were the Roman Empire during 2,000 years? They were in the Mediterranean, right? So the YEC timescale should predict an echo of the Roman Empire spraying off from one of the three primary nodes. And do we find that? Yes, we do find one for now. Creationists are still working on the transatlantic slave trade. So I will not use that as evidence. But I will use the Roman Empire echo in the map. It's hard to see here. But there's a branch there, which I think it's this one. This, can you point it out standing? Can you use the mouse to point it out?
I'm not sure. Let me see here. Can you see the
yeah, put it down, here, down, right, up. Okay, this one. This is the Mediterranean haplogroup spraying from the primary LMN pattern. As you can see, they're all Mediterranean. And what was happening, let's say this is the young Earth creationist timescale. From this M starting point, from up to here, the edge of that that branch, let's say it represents about, say, 6,000 years. And what is in the 6,000 years, like that? So what is in the middle of 6,000? What is happening 2,000 years ago? Roman Empire, right? So we expect the Roman Empire to branch off, the Mediterranean people to branch off during the Roman Empire. And there it is. Can you see it? It's hard to explain it without the mouse, without the mouse pointing where I want it to point. But okay, but my point is this. We have testable predictions, preliminary fulfilled prediction. And we are still working on the transatlantic slave trade. But we have one. If this reaches 5 extra biblical events found in a mitochondrial DNA differences comparison worldwide. In this map, if we found 5, evolution is dead, whether you like it or not. Right now, we only have 1. We're still working on the transatlantic. So we will not live to see the day this prediction is correct or is true or not. Evolutionists, if you're not going to entertain other views because you don't want the other views or you think it doesn't use the scientific method, well, we also use the scientific method, but we do not incorporate evolutionary assumptions to it like you do.
Well, thanks for that. There, Superbad. I think that's certainly a dismantling of certainly at least everything that Crispr was saying yesterday. I'm glad that we gave you the floor here to say what you had to say. That was, I would say, the evolutionists should look into those testable predictions as well, being fulfilled. Right now, really, as we speak. But to go on to a second topic, I wanted Neff to take over here because we talked about briefly, if you can hear me there, Neff, we talked about chromosome 2, and I noticed you were really giving Drag there a run for his money. I mean, the guy was falling all over himself. I can't remember if it was Crispr that came to the rescue as usual, or usually it's either Crispr or Sam that comes to the rescue of these guys, Immutable and Drag. But human chromosome 2, right? They're saying that it arose through a fusion of 2 ape-like chromosomes. But we know that this, apparent fusion site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. Did you want to expand on that? One for Guzman. I know Guzman was exposed to that through some biblical compromiser named Robert from Sentinel Apologetics. The guy won't debate it.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be happy to. Let me take a bathroom break. I'll be going about 1.5 minutes, and then I'll be happy to expound upon that. The argument that was made by the evolutionists in the hangout the other day were just their ideas from their head, things that they need to believe, but not actually scientific. And I'd love to talk about that for just a minute and explain why the real science gets denied by evolutionists because it doesn't comport with their evolution theory. Give me about 60 seconds.
Well, because if we actually look, and while he's gone, I'll fill in, Guzman. If we actually, look at recent reanalysis of the human chromosome 2, we know that it's now contradicted this evolutionary prediction, right? It kind of falls all in line with the junk DNA paradigm, and this junk DNA paradigm has certainly been overturned to the point that there's actually no significant evidence that this actual fusion exists. And what the facts are is that this alleged site, say where this fusion supposedly took place, actually represents a highly organized and functional gene. So if you actually start from the assumption of, say, human to ape common ancestry, it's evident now that evolutionists have actually made a failed prediction about the structure and function of DNA within our cells. So at the end of the day, a lot of their, strongest arguments, say for, in this case, ape to human common ancestry, it really has been overturned. And they'll fight it tooth and nails. They'll never give it up. There's too much at stake, as Superbad was indicating. I'm not sure if you heard any of that, Neff. I know you were.
No, I just came back about 15 seconds ago. So.
I was just talking about briefly how the human chromosome 2 is really just a failed evolutionary prediction because of the highly organized functional gene.
Yeah.
In the alleged site, right? Did you want to expand on that a little bit?
Yes. Yes, it's been discovered that there are 1,996 functional associations with biological entities spanning 7 categories that include molecular profile, organismal, chemical, functional term, phrase or reference, cell line, cell type or tissue. That cell type means cell specialization. Cells are given genetic information when they split sometimes that determines what kind of cell it's going to be. Is it going to be a pancreas cell? Is it going to be a heart muscle cell? And this is how an organism develops in their fetal development stage. As an organism develops, cells are specialized, and information in a given cell, when a cell splits, cells aren't produced just de novo in an organism. They're not just created. All cells in organisms come into being because a previous cell splits and doubles it splits the genome, and the cell splits into two cells, and each one gets a copy of the genetic material. That's how new cells form, not by a new cell being created, but by a cell splitting into two. So that's how cells are made. That's called, and when that happens during fetal development, like when your mother has you in your womb and you're developing over a period of 9 months, different cells specialize to become this kind of tissue, that kind. There's over 250 some odd tissues types in a human being. So a cell is given a specific genetic information twist during the cell division that tells that you're going to become this kind of cell. Instead of a brain cell, you're going to be an intestinal wall lining cell, or you're going to be a bladder cell, or you're going to be a nerve cell, or an artery cell, or a heart valve cell. That's called cell specialization. So these 1996 known functional associations of the genes that I'm about to explain include cell specialization, genes, proteins or mitochondrial RNA, I'm sorry, and they relate to 20 different data sets. Now, here's the thing. This imagined chromosome fusion site, evolutionists say, well, human beings and chimpanzees have during the evolution of mankind, the chromosomes fused, and that's why we find this profound evidence for evolution, because the difference in chromosomes between humans and chimps is explained by two chromosomes having fused in the history of man. Okay. Now, the problem is that science has discovered that, imagine in your mind, from the left to the right, we have a line going across your screen, okay? And you draw a line down the middle, a dot in the center of that line. And let's pretend that's the fusion site, okay? Now, to the left of it is the human chromosome. To the right is another human chromosome, and they fuse together, right? So now, in the dot in the center is where they fused. And that's what evolutionists claim is evidence that humans and chimps are related. But here's the major problem with that. There are genes that span all the way across that dot in the center. Gene sets, not just a gene, numerous genes that cross over that fusion site, that dot in the middle. And they have all these different types of functions, 7 categories: molecular profile, organism, chemical, functional term, phrase or in reference, cell line, cell tissue, protein, mitochondrial RNAs. All these types of the information in the genes that span across that dot, that fusion site, supposed fusion site, relate to these different categories of critical function in a human being. Now, it gets really deep. Kind of try to stay with what I'm about to say. I want people who know nothing about what I'm saying to understand, because there are people who say, man, I don't have a clue what you're talking about. And it's not that I'm so smart or that I'm telling you stuff that's really complex. It's just that once people get engrossed in this kind of thing, they tend to use terms that some people who have never encountered any debate about evolution or creation, they don't know what they mean. So they don't know what the heck you're talking about. I want to make it simple so everybody can understand the failure of the evolutionist claim that this is a fusion site. Okay. So the dot in the center is where these two chromosomes, these two giant bundles of genetic information came together and merged, and they became fixed and stuck to each other, and they're permanent. Now they're forevermore together. Okay. But the problem with that is that there are many complex genes that read, if you read them left to right, like you're going to read a sentence in a book, and you start to the left and the words go on to all the way to the right until you find the period all the way on the right side, right? The problem is that sentence goes across the dot, the supposed site where the two chromosomes fused. You see what I mean? Who wrote the sentence that goes all the way across the spot where there was supposedly two entirely different and related books that were snapped together? How is that possible? How do you have a coherent sentence? Not only does the sentence, is it a coherent one, but it relates to functions that are critical for the book on the left and the book on the right to even exist. Else, they couldn't function. And some of these functions are, one of them is that these codes, these genes, and this set of genes is called DDX11L2. And it produces, one of the things that it produces is what's called helicase. Now, helicase is a really complex set of molecular machinery stuck together that produces a single machine. And that machine duplicates the DNA molecule in your cells. In other words, the DNA, this machine, it's really complex, made of proteins and numerous components, latches onto the DNA, and it starts to duplicate it, to make a copy, because you have to have the duplication of the DNA molecule going on in the cells, or you don't you can't survive. The DNA has to be duplicated. And it's duplicated constantly. In your body right at this moment, there are probably hundreds of thousands of DNA molecules that are being duplicated by this quote-unquote helicase machinery at this second. It's constant. Okay, so this machine is, let's imagine an automobile engine. Okay, so let's imagine that one component in that automobile engine is its heads. That is the block of the heads with the valve train in it, in an overhead cam valve engine. You've got the camshaft, you've got the valve springs, you got the rockers, you've got the valve springs, you got the valve guides, you got the valve stems themselves. All that is one component of the engine, and the other is a block, and then another component is the crankshaft. And then another component, let's imagine that if we could liken all the piston rods with the pistons and piston rings connected, is a separate component. All the pistons and the churning component inside the engine. Okay, that's another unit. Okay, that's kind of what we're talking about when we're talking about helicase. It's numerous complex molecules arranged in a specific manner so that each one has functions, and then they are different ones are put together to comprise a much bigger component, like the heads and the block and the crankshaft with the piston rings and everything, connecting rods and pistons and piston rings are all a separate unit, put together make an engine in your car. So these helicase machines combined together create the helicase machine, and it duplicates the DNA molecule. It's critical to the function of your life. If it didn't exist, you would not exist. And it spans the dot in the middle of the page. In other words, it starts on the left and it ends on the right. It goes across the dot. Now, if the dot represents the spot where one chromosome on the left and one chromosome on the right came together and fused, these genes with all these different functions, and one of them it being that it produces this macro collective, outrageously complex collection of molecular machines that could together produce a machine called helicase that duplicates the DNA molecule, then it's not plausible that part of the DNA, the helicase, or any of these other functions like cell specialization, that information on one side, information on another, happen to block together, and then boom, we get the processes. That's not plausible. That's out. Can't believe that. Therefore, if this was actually a fusion site, here's what would have had to have happened. The genes that create the helicase and the other functions that are important for cell specialization and whatnot had to have been made so that they span across that fusion site after the fusion took place. And that would have had to have happened by random genetic mutation. And in our last hangout, I asked Crispr and a couple of other people, what's the reason for believing that? And Dragnock Silvas simply refused to answer my question. Their response to me was, well, Nephi, when you understand enough about science for me to talk to you, give me a call. That's the kind of response that we got out of them, instead of an actual scientific response.
And then meanwhile, we asked Drag for hours to come on and have a simple discussion with you. I mean, at least we'll give Crispr credit. You know, he certainly talked with you for, you know, extended amount of time. But that Drag, he must have Neph nightmares.
Well, I mean, instead of answering the question or talking about it intellectually, we get these ridiculous hand-waving, well, I can't respond. Obviously, they can't respond against the real science with their philosophy. So the way to fix the problem for them is to prevent, because they can't answer, they got to have a tool to explain why they can't answer. Like, Nephi, when you understand cell mutation, let me know. This is their way of dealing with it. They can't deal with it, so they come up with these childish responses. So here's the thing, that these genes span the supposed fusion site. They have critical functions for the existence of the organism. Crispr actually told me they're non-functional. That was his way of responding to the evidence, that they're non-functional. The problem is that these functions are listed in a genetic database as functional. So what he's doing there is saying, science isn't true. What I believe and what I tell you is true. I don't care that they're documented as having function and they're recorded in genetic databases as being functional. I'm telling you, they're not functional. So what we've got is the belief system of the evolutionist turned into supposed science, which refutes actual, observable, tested, repeated, documented science.
Well, it's just like, you know, the apparent pseudo gene that evolutionists like to harp on or to promote. You know, supposedly this remain of a gene devoted to egg yolk production that's apparently in our DNA in exactly the same place that evolution would predict. But just like many other, you know, specific genetic markers, specific pseudogenes, chromosome 2, we know that this recent research has actually exposed this as nearly impossible to reconcile with the actual facts.
Completely
They'll
impossible.
fight it, you know. Yeah. But at the end of the day, this supposed evidence, say for the egg yolk gene, it's so pathetic, it's so sad that it's hard to imagine that anyone could have actually entertained this, you know, hypothesis.
Yeah, they shouldn't, because the germ lines that produce different features in one organism and another don't line up with that egg germline cell thing. That idea was discredited. In fact, over 100 years ago, even almost before they even understood what DNA really did, that idea was already refuted. Well, let me finish about what I was saying briefly, if you don't mind. The the supposed fusion site is spanned by critical genes that produce machinery that's critical to the function of the organism, and self-specialization information overlapping in a nested information that does wonderful 7 different categories of critically important information in the human cell and organism. Okay, but now, as I pointed out, those overlapping and nested genes that span the supposed fusion site would have had to have been produced by evolution, by mutation and natural selection after the fusion, because they're there, right? So, but the problem for that is that science doesn't document any reason for believing that random genetic mutations can build genetic information, that it can create overlapping and nested information, which requires the sharing of base pairs between one sequence of information, quote unquote gene, and another sequence of information, quote unquote gene. We have no scientific reason to believe that malarkey at all. All we observe is mutations destroy. But evolutionists, in their wild, crazy, mythological, religiously ardent, and fervent belief system, believe that mutations can do this kind of ridiculous thing. That mutations are going to design, and mutation would have had to have designed, all those overlapping and nested genes in that DD11XL site, in order for that to have happened after the supposed fusion of these 2 chromosomes. But there is nothing in science, not one thing, that makes anybody believe there is a scientific basis in believing that random genetic mutation can, 1, create information, 2, it can create overlapping and nested information, whereas information that in one sequence shares base pairs with another sequence of information that spans even a greater length, perhaps, than it is, wider to the left and the right.
Out there real quick, and it seems like, because in the chat, Crispr, it seems like if you put it all in a nutshell, he's just saying, and I imagine many other evolutionary scientists, well, there's no actual evidence for function.
Yeah, but it's already in genetic databases as functional.
Yeah.
So he's denying science right there.
Would you say a lot of them are science deniers?
All evolutionists are science denialists. When you show them science and it contradicts their philosophy, they'll deny the science to hold to their philosophy.
I think based on their arguments, whether it's spurious transcription or, there's function, but it's not a useful activity, I think they're just missing the bigger picture and the actual point, Neff, because first off, preliminary biochemical evidence for function does not exist merely, say, for, the examples of pseudogenes that we were talking about. It actually exists for at least 80% of all pseudogenes in humans. And then the other 20% may actually still yet to be found, functional in some human tissue or under some physiological condition yet to be studied. And there are many. So really, it all comes down to the fact that many non-coding RNA genes, say like these pseudogenes, are only expressed under certain conditions. And then we get into the whole embryonic, placental type functions. I mean, junk DNA really is dead, but why do they have to hold on to it so strongly?
Well, they do. But listen, here's an interesting thing too also. CRISPR said that they're not functional. Science demonstrates they are. They've already been documented in a database, a genetic database that says they are. But let's pretend for a second that his claim, although already fallacious, were true. That these genes, although they do code for helicase and other things, are not functional. Let's say they're there, but they're never used by the DNA. Let's pretend that were true, but it's not. But that's what CRISPR said. Let's pretend that's true. That still doesn't explain the existence of them. You're still wanting us to believe that random genetic mutation, then after the fusion site, listen to the insanity of this now. Listen carefully. CRISPR is still expecting us to believe that random, unguided, undirected molecular interactions will create the genetic information that just so happens to mirror exactly the same genes that code for the helicase, the outrageously complex helicase machine for a gene that's found somewhere else in the genome exactly like it. and create that after the fusion site. And it's going to do, random mutations are going to do that after the fusion site. They're going to build the same genes that create the functional helicase machinery. I mean, what in the world could possibly make that rational? Now, the only explanation that he could come forth with after this is, and he never got to this, but this is where I would have to take him if I questioned him and pummeled him with science. He would have to come to this. Well, it's a duplicate mutation. Genetic information over here was copied and inserted and rewritten over the base pairs that span the fusion site, rewritten over it. Okay, but when that kind of thing happens in genomic information, it doesn't happen by rewriting an entire set of base pairs. It happens by copy and paste, an intelligent design process, just like you do with Microsoft Windows. You copy and paste things. That can happen. That is a real genetic process. Information can be copied by the genome using algorithms, or go way over here to the other side of the DNA in a new location and cut the DNA molecule, paste that snippet of information in, fuse it, and connect the ends again. And now you've got a new chunk of DNA in there that was copied from one place and pasted into it on the other. Nobody knows of any genetic process where information is copied on one place and then machinery connects to the DNA and overwrites all the information that's present to rewrite that as something else to create the helicase. It's not known to science. That does not happen genetically. So that's the only place somebody like CRISPR could have gone, is to say that the reason we find these specialized genes that, like, for example, the ones that code for helicase that span the fusion site, is because information was copied from one place in the genome and then it rewrote all the base pairs across the fusion site to make those genes. That is not a genetic process. That doesn't happen in DNA. Insert, copy, and paste into, move the information down some, and snap a new piece in, that happens. Copy and rewrite a whole section of genetic information for new genes doesn't happen. What that would also do is completely destroy all the genetic information that it copied over. That's just not a process in the DNA. So again, the evolutionists, when you ask them these kinds of things and show them this kind of evidence, they have to continuously, with their rebuttals, with their attempt to respond, continuously back themselves into a corner, to a smaller corner, to a smaller corner, to a smaller corner, to a smaller corner, each one being scientifically false, to a point where what the ultimate answer that they have to give to explain, for example, these genes, like the one that codes for helicase, spanning the fusion site, is something that's so utterly absurd and obviously scientifically false that everything that they've said from the beginning about the subject was just their ideas in their head and not science. So the fusion site cannot be a fusion site. In summary, let me sum it up really quick. In summary, it can't be a fusion site because the place where these chromosomes supposedly join together, what spans across that fusion site, just like a bridge going across a river, is numerous genes that have 7 different categories of critically important function to an organism, that one of which is the codes for the machinery, very complex machinery that duplicates the DNA molecule. You ought to see a video of that, how that operates on the internet. It'll blow your mind. The machinery. Look for that. It'll blow your mind. That machinery is coded across this fusion site, and it's not something copied and pasted in, and it can't be something that was copied and rewritten over, because that doesn't happen, except in the immune system to make an enzyme. That's it. That's the only copy and rewrite new stuff. It's the enzymes that do that. That's the immune system. Okay, so the idea that it's a fusion site is not plausible, and the arguments put forth by people like CRISPR and others that try to explain this away can be backed down by asking one question after another to demonstrate it's not only scientifically implausible, it's utterly absurd. And science kills that idea because of one thing, and then I'm done. Sequences of information that code for special critically important functions in a human being, including the machinery that duplicates the DNA molecule, spans all the way across that supposed fusion site. And that can't have been created before or after a supposed fusion, because there's no genetic mechanism for that. It just gets that simple. It can't be true.
No, I find it funny because if you look at a lot of their, purported evidence, we now know human chromosome 2. Well, you know what? That site is actually a functional DNA element in a human gene. These pseudogenes, the fact that they say humans and chimpanzees share genetic mistakes, aka pseudogenes. We now know these pseudogenes appear to be functional DNA elements, not actually mistakes. What's another one that they use that has failed? Even the fact that, they say human to chimpanzee genetic identity is 98 to 99% similar. But now, based on the data, genetic identity is only 88% similar. And to put that into perspective, that's over 400 million DNA differences that actually exist between the two species. So, I mean,
Yes.
How do they reconcile that all their, major evidence for pond-scum-to-people evolution is just falling apart bit by bit?
It's dead. It's already scientifically dead. And the remarkable thing is that when you point out that this, that when creationists first pointed out that it's been discovered that critically functional genes span the fusion site, for example, they said they weren't there. So then we show them over and over and over and over and over again. Yes, they're there. So then they finally accept, okay, we can't play that game anymore. So, okay, they're there. And then they say, well, things like what Crispr said, well, they're not functional. And so that's somehow going to fix the problem. And then you can show them over and over and over and over again. Yes, they're functional. Here's what they're doing. Genetic database shows that they're functional. List them as functional. And then they would, but they haven't even gotten there yet. They would have to say, okay, so they're functional. And then you could ask them, well, how did they become to being? So they would have had to have been written after the fusion site. What genetic mechanism is there for the rewriting of a massive string of data of base pairs with new genetic information copied from somewhere else? Just DNA. Where does the DNA just take genetics? Say, well, I don't think this long string of bits is worth anything, so I'm just going to write over it. Just make it something new. What kind of computer programmer does that with his software? Since when do computer programmers say, write a software application that says, I decided that line 256 in my program is worth nothing, so just write over it with some stuff to do something else. And what happened to that line? Well, it's just destroyed. Does the genome do that? No, it just doesn't do that.
Well, and the fact that, their mechanisms, mutation selection, they're not going to build a genome. As a matter of fact, human mutation is catastrophic. And what I find funny too is that most informed people in the field of population genetics, Neff, they are aware that there is a growing genetic load due to the accumulation of deleterious mutations. Exactly. And this is really, this is regardless of what, these science deniers say, because at the end of the day, what can selection plus mutation actually do, and what can it do? And I think it's been demonstrated, thoroughly that it obviously can't build the genome. And like I said at first, it really just comes down to a net loss versus a net gain. And exactly. At the end of the day, that doesn't bode well for evolution at all. And they don't seem to acknowledge the fact that this human genetic degeneration is a real and serious concern. Actually, since Superbad is back, I wanted to ask him one quick question.
You're exactly right about that. Let me say this one thing, and then I'm going to take a 5-minute break. 20 of y'all talk about what you want. I want to comment on what you just said. You're exactly right. This idea, this highly documented discovery that DNA is decaying because of the accruing of random genetic mutations, which is about 100 per person per generation, is, as you pointed out, a real major problem for evolution. In fact, it is a killer of evolution theory. And as you pointed out, you said evolutionist scientists are now having to confront these facts that have been discovered in the last 10 or 15 or 18 years now, and they don't know what to do with it because their theory says that can't be true. Mutations design stuff, but all the scientific data shows it's destroying. It's the opposite of what they believed. So what you said is exactly true, brother. Standing, that's exactly true. And that is one of the great killers of evolution theory right now. In fact, it is right now the hot topic in genetics.
It has killed
University
evolution.
professors in the world. They're all hashing this out and trying to understand how is it possible that our theory, our beloved theory of evolution, is true when science is showing us over and over and over again the mutation is killing, destroying genetic information and not building it like we used to, like we must believe for evolution to be true. Excellent point.
Well, like you just said, I'll expand on that. It is startling, that most of the 100 to 300 mutations per person per generation that you talked about, they are unselectable. They're actually invisible to natural selection. And I always compare it to like a single rust molecule. They're actually invisible to a car inspector. And you know what? The atheists hate that analogy because of the truth that it conveys and the straw man arguments that I hear. Like I've heard one review of drag and the guy has no comprehension of what we mean by entropic degeneration of the genome. And actually he wasn't even smart enough to use this argument, but I know Immutable constantly repeats it. He says, most mutations are not harmful, but neutral. And that response strongly misunderstands the point at hand, Neff, because yes, most mutations are neutral from the perspective of the organism's physical fitness, right? Its phenotype, but all mutations must have effect on the actual genetic content, right? The genotype. So in no way are mutations truly neutral. They really must have effect on the genotype. So most are slightly harmful, and these near neutral mutations, they are accumulating in the genome. Evolution, natural selection mutation can't build the genome. It can't even stop the degeneration process. Superbad, if you want to unmute yourself, I know you stepped away for a little while. Can you hear me, brother?
I'm busy.
Can you? Are you open for a question here?
Hang on, I'm busy. You guys can talk. Hang on, I'm busy.
Cool, because I know. You said you had some visitors there, because I really don't see, genetic entropy having a solution, having a resolution, because like I said, the human mutation rate, 100 mutations per person per generation, meaning our children have about 100 more mutations than we have, and our grandchildren will have 100 more mutations than they have. On a personal level, it's more than disturbing, but on a population level, it's certainly destructive to evolutionary theory and the rescue devices of natural selection, rescue devices of beneficial mutations, just like the response that most mutations are not harmful but neutral, really just misunderstands the entire point at hand. And what's funny is, and I've actually talked about this with CRISPR, the Lenski's long-term bacterial experiment. It's funny because they actually support the genetic entropy thesis. And Dr. John Sanford just spoke at NIH recently, and it's funny because the usual atheist arguments, actually, you won't find a serious response by any population geneticist.
No, they don't.
You'll find a couple blogs, like there's one, his name's Scott. He makes a blog. It's extremely weak. Dr. John Sanford did give a response, but the arguments are pathetic. And he just spoke at NIH, and he gave a great a lecture there, and the objections and questions during the question and answer were just the usual ones that I've actually heard, plus a few more technical ones. That evolutionists say like drag would, obviously never be able to come up with. But Dr. John Sanford answered him perfectly. His program, Mendel's accountant, it's proving sufficiently that these accumulation of near neutral mutations, they can't be stopped. But I wanted to talk about Lenski's long-term bacterial experiment, because they actually support genetic entropy, because the rapid growth seen in this, it was actually largely accomplished through genetic degeneration, and many useful genes not essential in that actual environment were apparently lost. So it's actually been degenerated changes that we've seen even in bacteria. And one of their objections will be, how come we don't see it in bacteria? But we're seeing it in bacteria. Neff, if you got a point to say to that.
Well, yeah, Lenski's experiments only proved that mutations. What Lenski did was he carried on a genetic mutation experiment, still going on to this day, basically. That is, he raised numerous generations of different bacteria in the laboratory, and he'd mutate them individually. Each generation he'd mutate them. And so the mutated bacteria would give rise to a new population of bacteria that contained the mutation that he had given the previous one. And then he would give them a mutation. And now they've got two, at least, and so they would produce a population, and then they carry on the mutations that were received, and he mutates them. And they get another one, and so they carry it on, the offspring, and so et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, generation after generation after generation. It's been done for over 50,000 generations now. And what Lenski discovered very quickly was the 500th generation of mutants were less fit for survival than the first, and they were more fit for survival than the 10,000th. So, and what they discover is these mutations make the organism, the bacteria, unfit for survival. They may allow them to adapt to an immunity. Let's say they put some kind of antibiotic in the petri dish, and the mutation may enable them to survive with the antibiotic present where they couldn't before without it. But here's the problem. To make that ability, a good gene is damaged that makes the bacteria able to survive in the environment of the antibiotic. But then after the antibiotic is removed, and the bacteria, of course, are fed a diet of sugar, and their environment is different from the real world. It's one maintained by intelligent design in the laboratory. Once those bacteria are then put into their normal environment, they die because they're unfit. They're unfit. So the mutation in the end, it makes the organism unfit to survive, even if it provides the short-term ability to survive the presence of an antibiotic. But when returned to the non-artificial environment of the laboratory, the bacteria simply go extinct. So this in nature, as evolution would have us believe, this change, these mutations, made the bacteria unfit to survive. Not develop anything new or structural in their body plans and their anatomy. It didn't develop anything novel or great. It just made them unfit to survive outside of the highly controlled, highly manipulated, very specific environment of a petri dish in a laboratory.
Well, I find it funny because even when beneficials, and I say that, very loosely, I'd use beneficials, quote unquote, happen, they're always a loss of function type of mutation. Even then, they're very rare. And if you look at their examples, they're always examples of degraded information, right? You got sickle cell anemia that comes to mind. There's degraded information. Lenski's experiment, right? The aerobic citrate digestion by bacteria.
Exactly.
That was observed to be, I think it was based on the loss of control of the normal anaerobic citrate digestion. You got, nylon digestion by bacteria. You see that brought up quite a bit. What did that involved a loss of substrate specificity. And they all involve decay of prior information. So at the end of the day, it's not explaining that net loss versus net gain. I've seen people use, what is it? I think it was 20% or something of Western Europeans developed an immunity to HIV infection. And that was actually due to a broken receptor. I've heard Dr. Herman Mays say, European adult lactose tolerance, there's a big beneficial mutation, but that's due to a broken lactase.
A broken gene.
These are all, it's all consistent with creation,
Exactly. You got to damage. You got to damage the information to get a benefit that's only specific to a limited environment. That doesn't help a new species come into being. How's that support evolution? Yeah.
Well, remember that mutation where the femur bone got a little longer. That'll combat all these.
Hey, wait a minute.
Thousands of deleterious mutations.
Wait a minute. My bones are getting longer. I'm done. Whew, that was painful. Okay,
that's
I'm
your
in
fish
species now.
That's your fish to fisherman
right
there. But at the end of the day, in all seriousness, none of those examples are satisfactory evidence for an actual increase in biological complexity over time, and that's why I say fish to fisherman evolution is actually dead. Superbad, are you still busy or what's going on there, brother? Can you hear us, Superbad? You got to unmute yourself.
What is it?
I wanted to ask you because we were talking about, and I'm gonna have to close this down in a few minutes. So I wanted to get everybody to say some final words. But actually, I think it went really well. I think I wanted to ask, I think, 2 questions. Okay, I'm gonna want Neph just to give us a basic rundown of what he felt that global flood debate went between, Immutable, who ended up running halfway through, Crispr and Drag. I think he did great. I think you really defended the global flood model quite well. And to Superbad, I know you're quite knowledgeable on, junk DNA, the junk DNA paradigm. What do you feel about the rescue devices that, people like CRISPR, scientist Sam, that they use, and the fact that they're in conflict with a lot of the scientists, that have discovered that, a large portion of our genome is functional, through ENCODE? How do you feel about that, Superbad? And then if you could answer your question, Neff, to kind of finish it off, go ahead.
Well, the junk DNA idea actually was termed by, I forgot who he is. And never mind who coined it. But the basis for junk DNA is we see billions of dead things buried in rock layers all over the earth. Right? So using evolutionary assumptions, they assume the DNA is also like that. Billions of junk, just like the fossil record. Dead, useless, dead. So that's their basis. So, sorry, what were you asking again?
Well, because we know that, junk DNA has been overturned. It's decades ago biology.
Yes.
A lot of the evidence is preliminary, but it's certainly suggesting function, especially because we know so little about the DNA language, and we know so little about that, embryological developmental process, that step-by-step process on what the DNA does on a molecular level in the embryo. So my question is, how do you feel about the evolutionary bias, the community that is actually still trying to use the junk DNA argument?
Actually, based on my experience, I have witnessed 2 sides of evolutionists. There are theistic evolutionists and atheistic evolutionists. More or less, theistic evolutionists accept that junk DNA is dead. The head of the former Human Genome Project, one of the smartest men in the world, Dr. Francis Collins, said, and I quote, I forgot the exact quote, but he said, "We don't know much about the DNA to determine if something is neutral or non-functional or whatever you might call it. We don't know." Okay? And do you know what he said in his book, which I read a long time ago? He wrote it in 2007 or 6, as I recall. He said that the junk DNA is proven, finally. Proven. We've proven evolution. And what did he say 2015? Junk DNA is dead.
Yeah.
Junk DNA is no more.
Good
And not
point.
only that, yes. So theistic evolutionists or Christian evolutionists accept the death of junk DNA. But atheist evolutionists do not. And we know why they do not. Because they need those junk DNA to construct their phylogenetic trees, their common ancestry genetic markers. If they are functional, then it becomes a common designer argument. If they're junk, then they are evolutionary leftover from billions of years. It's that simple. And that's why they fight so hard. They try to get you into all those technical bullshits.
Well, you've seen my discussions with Crispr, scientist Sam. You know, these guys that fight the junk DNA paradigm. You know, so hard. They give so much energy to do so.
It will never end.
No, it really is a never-ending war. But thank you for answering that question, Superbad. I want to thank you also for joining us today. I think it was very good. It was technical. If anyone has any questions in the audience, you can email me. We'll do our best to help you out, help you understand it. And then to kind of just end it here, Neph, you know, we're looking for just some quick feedback on how you felt your portion of the discussion went. I think it was the first 2 hours you debated on global flood model. You know, started off with immutable, you know, went into CRISPR drag. I think it went well. How do you feel? Do you feel like they strawmanned you a bit? Do you think that they, you know, brought forth some rescue devices? You know, how do you feel it went?
Well, I think you're doing a great job as a hangout moderator for these debates. I think your channel's got a long way to go. You're really good. You're knowledgeable. I have to say, you know, kudos to you. I love to run into people like yourself that are really knowledgeable about stuff and not just somebody who doesn't know anything. And so I'm really looking forward to the you know, the future of your channel. I think it's really going to be something to be really important. I really do believe that. But I think the arguments put forth, it seems as though the counters to the arguments that we put forth as creationists, and I put forth in the arguments in the last hangout that I had with some of the people you're speaking of, were basically that can't be true because I say so. That's kind of what the arguments amount to. And they rely upon the unknown. Atheists love to point to the unknown and claim that's science, and then they also deny what's known and claim it's not true. And so atheism and evolutionists really are actually science denialists. But let me just say this before in closing. I'll say when it comes to, we've been talking a lot about genetics. The very existence of the DNA molecule disproves evolution theory and verifies intelligent design for a couple of reasons. The first is the complexity of the DNA molecule. Mathematical simulations of probability about the formation of a DNA molecule without intelligence show that it will never happen. In a million ages of a universe, there's not enough time for natural selection to make it happen. Chemistry does not order. Nature does not order molecules into specified complexity. It does not happen. Okay. Secondly, information, DNA is a physical medium which includes information which is organized to conform to linguistics properties. Symbolism of language does not exist in physics or chemistry. You have to have a mind to apply a mental property to matter, a meaning to matter, or to interpret a meaning from a symbol. Okay, so symbolism of language and DNA is organized grammatically. That's linguistics. That is not capable of being produced by chemistry and physics, period. You have to have an intelligence for that. So that's another refuter. Algorithms in DNA. Algorithms are mathematical equations designed to compare information and decide what work must be done based on the comparison of information. That requires a mental process, not a physical or chemical one. Evolution can't be true because DNA is algorithmically operational. Our DNA possesses linguistics laws, which require symbolism, as I pointed out already. Symbolism does not exist in chemistry or math or physics. Molecules don't say, I think I'll represent something like, no, it doesn't happen. They simply are. The idea of representing something is a mental process which requires intelligence. So the very existence of the DNA molecule unequivocally disproves atheistic evolution and provides overwhelming, beyond overwhelming evidence that all life forms were designed by an intelligence of unfathomable genius because of the complexity of the information's arrangement and its spatial relationships across the DNA molecule, the linguistics, the algorithms, and the very existence of information. All these are non-physical fundamental entities which cannot be produced by material process. So any materialistic, purely chemical or physics explanation for the existence of DNA is scientifically impossible. There must be intelligence for DNA to exist. And this kills all evolution theory ideas and points to a creator. That's all I have to say. But I appreciate you giving me the time to say it.
No, I always appreciate you coming on, Neff. I'm glad we did this hangout today. I hope it's profitable to our fellow young Earth creation brothers. I hope that we can do many more of these. And I also appreciate the compliment. I hope that there is more to come. I think there's just so much to study. Sometimes it can be overwhelming, but there's just so much evidence backing biblical creation at the end of the day. That's probably why it's so hard to actually find opponents willing to discuss.
Or engage in academic style debate. They run from that idea. Yeah.
Well, the thing is, if I believe that banana plants and elephants shared a common ancestor, I'd probably be unwilling to defend such a belief as well. And all jokes aside, I mean, there really is so much evidence for biblical creation. I think us creationists, really need to dig deep. Because the evolutionists are militant, but if we study the evidence and become prepared and armed, it's not as intimidating as it seems. I mean, evolution is not hard at all to debunk.
Exactly. Let me say one more thing, if I might. In this very hangout, we have a 12-year-old boy, God bless him, who is an apologist for creation. I mean, you gotta love it, man. This kid is a superhero in my book, man. My hat's off to you. He's giving scientific arguments for creation and refuting evolution. He's 12 years old, this guy.
He's 12 years old, and I'm looking in the chat, and he's he's refuting these evolutionists in the chat that have probably been at this for years. So it's nice to see a growing number of creationist warriors.
What kind of arguments is he going to be providing when he's 20?
Let alone 30.
For him, right?
Yeah. I think it's great. Let's do this again soon, hopefully. Superbad. Any final words?
We're still on the air. I thought.
Yeah, but we're about to end, brother. It's been fun. We've said a lot. Hopefully people can watch this and profit from it. Everybody watching, thanks for joining. Standing for Truth is out. Have a good night.